I moved to Sycamore Ridge for the peace. The brochures promised tree-lined streets, smiling neighbors, and a tight-knit community, the kind of place where people waved from their porches and borrowed sugar like it was a Norman Rockwell painting. Come to life, and for the first few weeks, it was exactly that. My golden retriever, Duke, enjoyed our long morning walks without a leash. My home office had the perfect view of the pond, and I had even started to believe that I had finally found a slice of suburban paradise. Then I met Brenda Whitmore. Brenda was the self-appointed queen of Sycamore Ridge, ruling with the kind of authority usually reserved for third-world dictators and DMV employees. She was in her mid-50s, always wore pastel-colored blazers, and had the kind of frosted blonde hair that looked permanently windblown, even when it wasn't windy. She was the president of the Homeowners Association, a title she wielded with more power than a Supreme Court justice and far less wisdom. I first encountered Brenda over my mailbox. More accurately, my illegal mailbox. She strode up my driveway with the confidence of someone who had never once been told no. She held a clipboard like it was an extension of her soul. "Excuse me, Mr. Calloway," she said, eyeing my freshly installed black metal mailbox like it was a biohazard. "This is unacceptable," I blinked. "My mailbox?" She tapped the clipboard with a manicured nail. "All mailboxes in Sycamore Ridge must be classic sandstone beige per Section 4.2 of the HOA guidelines. Yours is black." I looked at the mailbox, then back at her. "Yeah, I picked black. I like it." She let out a tight, humorless laugh. "That's not how this works." I grinned. "You mean I can't just pick a color I like? Is this a mailbox dictatorship?" Her lips thinned into a line so tight I thought she might cut herself on it. "It's about maintaining order. You'll receive a formal notice in your mailbox by tomorrow morning. Failure to comply will result in escalating fines." She turned on her heel and marched back down my driveway, clipboard clutched against her chest like a shield. That should have been the end of it. A minor inconvenience. A weird introduction to neighborhood bureaucracy. But Brenda Whitmore didn't believe in minor inconveniences. By the following week, I had received 4 written warnings, 2 fines totaling $500, and a visit from Brenda herself, where she insisted, that I consider whether Sycamore Ridge is the right fit for me over a mailbox. So naturally, I left it exactly the way it was. That was the beginning of the war. The next offense was my driveway basketball hoop. It had been there since the day I moved in. I liked to shoot hoops in the evenings, nothing crazy, but one night, after sinking my last three-pointer, I noticed a laminated notice zip-tied to the pole. HOA violation. Unauthorized athletic equipment. Remove immediately or face penalties. Brenda, of course. I laughed. Then I crumpled up the notice and took my shot. Swish. The next morning, my basketball hoop was gone. Gone. I checked my security footage, and, sure enough, there was Brenda, supervising 2 HOA goons as they disassembled it in the dead of night. This was war. I decided that if she wanted to play dirty, I'd play dirtier. I started small. I parked my trash cans exactly 3 inches outside the designated storage area. Brenda showed up within hours with a measuring tape and a fine. I ignored it. She sent another. Ignored again. Then she escalated. One morning, I stepped outside to find that my lawn had been marked with red flags, condemned by some obscure HOA regulation, requiring an even distribution of Bermuda grass. Apparently, my grass was 60% Bermuda and 40% miscellaneous weeds, which was grounds for a violation. A neighbor whispered to me that Brenda once forced a retiree to resod his entire lawn because it didn't match the neighborhood aesthetic. I refused. The fines kept coming. She started turning the neighbors against me. At first, it was just whispers, then passive-aggressive comments, then a community meeting where Brenda theatrically read aloud my list of offenses like I was some kind of suburban felon. "This is about preserving our way of life," she declared. "If one homeowner refuses to comply, the whole neighborhood suffers." A few people nodded solemnly. That's when I knew Brenda wasn't just enforcing rules. She was consolidating power, and I was her personal enemy number one. I doubled down. Started hosting backyard barbecues, inviting over all the disgruntled neighbors. Started a side business selling custom mailbox wraps in any color but sandstone beige. Brenda lost her mind. She called an emergency HOA vote to revoke my residency. Little-known clause in the bylaws allowing the HOA to file for eviction if a homeowner is deemed detrimental to the community. Eviction, over mailboxes, basketball hoops, and slightly imperfect grass. I could feel the noose tightening. She was winning. The neighborhood was turning on me. Then I found it, a dusty old file in the county archives, a loophole, one that changed everything. Brenda had no idea what was coming. I sat in the county records office staring at the file like I had just uncovered the Ark of the Covenant. It was a simple document, yellowed with age, stamped and notarized decades ago, but the implications were monumental. I double-checked, then triple-checked. It was real. I leaned back in my chair, letting the weight of it settle in. Brenda had backed me into a corner, pushing her ridiculous fines, bogus regulations, and personal vendetta so far that she never once stopped to consider that she might not have the authority to do so. Because as it turned out, I wasn't just a homeowner in Sycamore Ridge. I owned Sycamore Ridge, not in some vague, metaphorical, take-back-the-neighborhood sense. I literally owned it. Well, technically, a land development trust did. A trust that had been created over 40 years ago by the original developer, left in limbo due to misfiled paperwork, and never properly transferred to the HOA when the neighborhood was established. The land, the common areas, even the very HOA charter itself, all still legally tied to the original trust. And I had just acquired it for exactly $1. See, when I was digging through the county archives, I wasn't just looking for dirt. On Brenda, I was desperate. The fines were piling up, and the HOA's threat of eviction wasn't just an empty power play anymore. She had rallied enough support to take legal action, and I was running out of options. That's when I found the trust. Turns out the developer's grandson, who technically inherited it, had no idea it existed, and was more than happy to sign it over when I explained the situation. One quick legal transfer, a couple of notarized documents, and the entire neighborhood was mine. Brenda Whitmore had been barking orders from a throne built on absolutely nothing. I almost felt bad for her. Almost. 2 days later, the HOA held its emergency meeting to finalize my eviction. Brenda sat at the head of the community center table, basking in the glow of her impending victory. She had even put on her best pastel blazer for the occasion. "This is not personal," she declared, pretending to sound regretful. "It's about maintaining the integrity of Sycamore Ridge. Mr. Calloway's actions have demonstrated a blatant disregard for our standards. If we allow this kind of behavior to continue, our home values will plummet." Murmurs of agreement rippled through the room. She had whipped them into a frenzy, convinced them that my basketball hoop and non-beige mailbox were the first signs of a crumbling civilization. "Therefore," she continued, "we are voting to remove Mr. Calloway from the community. The HOA will file for legal eviction, and his property will be—" I cleared my throat, loudly. Brenda's eyes snapped to me, irritated at the interruption. "Do you have something to say before we proceed?" I stood. "Actually, yeah. A few things." I pulled a folder from my bag and set it down on the table. "This is the official deed transfer for the Sycamore Ridge Land Development Trust. As of 2 days ago, I now control the entire neighborhood." Brenda blinked. The room fell silent. "Excuse me?" she scoffed, her lips curling into a disbelieving smirk. "That's absurd." "Is it?" I slid a copy of the paperwork toward her. "Go ahead, take a look. You'll see that this HOA doesn't actually own anything. You've been enforcing rules on land that legally never transferred to your authority." Brenda's face turned an alarming shade of red as she snatched up the document. Her eyes darted across the pages, scanning for a mistake, some technicality she could use to deny reality. But there wasn't one. "Oh, and since I now control the trust," I continued, "I also control HOA oversight, which means, effective immediately," I turned to the assembled neighbors. "Brenda Whitmore is removed as president of the HOA." The silence that followed was delicious. Brenda shot to her feet. "You can't do that." I absolutely can. I smiled. The bylaws state that the landowner has the right to oversee HOA governance. And, well, that's me now. I leaned in, lowering my voice just enough that only she could hear. You tried to evict the one person who had the power to evict you. Brenda was shaking now. Not from fear. No, she was too stubborn for that. But from sheer unfiltered rage. You can't just take over. Oh, I'm not taking over, I said cheerfully. In fact, I'm dissolving the HOA altogether. The room erupted. People gasped, whispered, exchanged shocked glances. A few were grinning, as if they'd just been unshackled from years of tyranny. Others looked horrified, realizing their precious arbitrary rules were about to vanish overnight. Brenda was barely breathing. You wouldn't. Oh, but I would. I turned to the neighbors again. For too long, this HOA has been run by one person's ego. No more pointless fines. No more ridiculous rules about mailbox colors or grass types. You all own your homes. You should be able to live in them without fear of being fined for existing. Murmur of agreement spread. The balance was shifting. Brenda slammed her hands on the table. You have no idea what you've done. I shrugged. Oh, I think I do. She opened her mouth to protest, but before she could, a voice from the back of the room spoke up. I second the motion to dissolve the HOA. Heads turned. It was Mrs. O'Reilly, an 80-year-old widow who had been battling Brenda for years over the color of her front door. One by one, hands shot up. A vote was called. It wasn't even close. Brenda had spent years building her little empire, and in a single meeting it was gone. I watched as the reality sank in. Her reign was over. But as I looked into her eyes, I knew. She wasn't done yet. No, Brenda Whitmore wasn't the kind of person who went down without a fight. And sure enough, she had one last trick up her sleeve. The meeting ended in chaos. Neighbors chattering, some celebrating, others mourning the end of the HOA's iron-fisted rule. Brenda, however, stormed out without another word. I knew that wasn't the last I'd see of her, and I was right. The next morning, I woke up to the sound of a police siren outside my house. 2 officers stood on my lawn, arms crossed, next to none other than Brenda Whitmore, looking smugger than ever. She was holding a folder thick with paperwork. Mr. Calloway, one of the officers said, "We need to talk." I sighed and rubbed my temples. Let me guess. Brenda here made some wild accusation that I committed some sort of crime? The officer nodded. She's filed an official complaint stating that your acquisition of the Sycamore Ridge Trust was fraudulent. I stared at her. Are you serious? Brenda folded her arms and gave me a smirk that could curdle milk. Fraudulent transfers are a felony, Mr. Calloway. I hope you have a good lawyer. I laughed. Out loud. Because this was so Brenda. The officers gave me a wary look, but I couldn't help myself. Brenda had played her final card, and it was a terrible one. Oh, Brenda, I said, shaking my head. You really don't know how to quit, do you? Her smirk faltered, but she recovered quickly. We'll see who's laughing when you're in court. I leaned against my porch railing. Well, since you love the law so much, you might want to check Section 418 of the county property statutes. She frowned. What? You know, the section that states that any claim of fraud regarding property transfers must be filed by an interested party, meaning someone who actually had a legal claim to the land. I shrugged. And seeing as how the HOA never owned this land to begin with, you don't qualify. Her face fell. One of the officers sighed. Ma'am, is this true? Brenda's mouth opened and closed like a fish gasping for air. Unless you were next in line to inherit the trust, I continued. Your claim has no legal standing, meaning, I gestured at the officers. They can't arrest me for something that doesn't concern you. The officers exchanged a look. The older one sighed. Ma'am, unless you have actual standing, this is a civil issue, not a criminal. 1. Brenda turned redder than a stop sign. But, he stole this neighborhood, she sputtered. No, Brenda. I stepped closer, lowering my voice so only she could hear. I saved it. For the first time since I met her, Brenda, was speechless. The officers gave me an apologetic nod and left. Brenda stood frozen in place, her entire world crumbling around her. And then, in one final act of pettiness, she spat on my lawn. "I'll be back," she hissed. "No, you won't," I said, grinning. "Because as the new landowner, I'm officially evicting you." Her eyes widened. "You can't do that. Can and will." I pulled out a fresh document, one I had drawn up last night knowing she'd try something. "You see, technically, the land your house sits on is my property. And now that the HOA is dissolved, you're just another homeowner. But unlike me, you've racked up over $11,000 in unpaid HOA fines. And without the HOA to back you, you've got no protection." Brenda gasped. "That's not—" "It is," I said cheerfully. "And since I own the land, I can foreclose on any property that falls into financial default. Which means—" I leaned in, relishing every second. "You've got 30 days to pack your bags, Brenda." I had never seen someone's soul leave their body before, but I'm pretty sure that's what happened in that moment. The news of Brenda's downfall spread faster than one of her ridiculous violation notices. Some people were sympathetic. Others, particularly the ones who had suffered under her rule for years, threw an impromptu block party to celebrate. Brenda fought it, of course. She filed appeals, tried to rally support, but no one wanted to be associated with her anymore. Without the HOA, she had no power. She was just another bitter neighbor with nowhere to turn. She moved out exactly 29 days later. On the morning of her departure, I watched from my porch as she loaded the last of her things into a U-Haul. She looked smaller somehow, deflated, defeated. She caught me watching, and for a moment I thought she might say something. A last insult, a final threat, but she just climbed into her truck and drove away. And just like that, Brenda Whitmore was gone. Life in Sycamore Ridge changed overnight. Without the HOA breathing down our necks, people started making little changes, painting their houses in fresh, lively colors, setting up porch swings, planting whatever flowers they wanted instead of the ones Brenda had dictated. The neighborhood felt alive for the first time. I even put my basketball hoop back up and my black mailbox? Yeah, it stayed. The biggest surprise came a month later when a for sale sign went up in Brenda's old yard. A young couple moved in, not an HOA tyrant in sight. One afternoon I walked over to introduce myself. The husband shook my hand, and the wife smiled warmly. "Nice to meet you," she said. "I have to say we were a little hesitant about moving here. We heard this place had a reputation." I grinned. "Not anymore." "Well, we're glad," she said. "It's just so nice to find a neighborhood that feels welcoming, you know?" I glanced around, taking in the sight of kids playing in their yards, neighbors chatting on their porches, a community finally free. "Yeah," I said, nodding. "It really is." And as I walked back to my house, I let out a deep, satisfied sigh. Sycamore Ridge was finally home, and best of all, there wasn't a single pastel blazer in sight.